Sarah Martinez had always been good at pretending. As a child, she would dress up in her mother's clothes and pretend to be a doctor, a teacher, or sometimes even a princess. But what started as innocent childhood games had evolved into something much more dangerous by the time she turned 25. The small town of Millbrook had always felt too small for Sarah's ambitions. She watched her classmates settle into ordinary jobs at the local diner, the hardware store, or the small factory on the outskirts of town. But Sarah wanted more. She craved respect, admiration, and, most of all, she wanted people to look at her with the kind of reverence reserved for those who had accomplished something extraordinary. It started innocently enough. During a conversation at the local coffee shop, someone mentioned how impressed they were with military personnel returning from overseas. Sarah, without thinking, nodded and mentioned that she understood their sacrifice because she had served herself. The lie slipped out so naturally that she almost believed it herself in that moment. The reaction was immediate and intoxicating. Suddenly, people were looking at her differently. They thanked her for her service, bought her coffee, and treated her with a respect she had never experienced before. That single moment of recognition was like a drug, and Sarah found herself craving more. Within weeks, Sarah had crafted an elaborate backstory. She told people she had been a medic in the army, stationed in Afghanistan for 2 tours of duty. She spoke about the desert heat, the camaraderie among soldiers, and the difficulty of adjusting to civilian life. She researched military terminology online, watched documentaries, and even visited military surplus stores to pick up authentic-looking gear. The transformation was remarkable. Sarah began carrying herself differently, with a confidence and authority that seemed to command respect wherever she went. She would wear combat boots with her civilian clothes, kept her hair in a tight ponytail, and spoke with the measured cadence she had observed in military personnel she had seen on television. Her newfound identity opened doors she had never imagined. The local veterans organization invited her to speak at their monthly meetings. She was offered discounts at restaurants and stores. Children would point at her on the street and whisper to their parents about the brave soldier lady. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt important. But maintaining the lie required constant vigilance. Sarah spent hours each day researching military protocols, studying maps of Afghanistan, and memorizing details about military life. She created fake deployment photos by carefully editing pictures she found online, inserting her face into group shots of real soldiers. She practiced military jargon in front of her mirror and developed calluses on her hands to make them look like they had seen combat. The deception grew more elaborate with each passing month. Sarah claimed she had received several commendations for her service, including a Purple Heart for injuries sustained in a roadside bombing. She limped slightly when she walked, claiming it was from shrapnel damage to her left leg. She would sometimes stop mid-conversation and stare off into the distance, as if reliving traumatic memories from the battlefield. Local media took notice of Sarah's story. The town newspaper ran a feature article about her service, complete with the fake photos she had provided. She was invited to speak at the high school's Veterans Day Assembly, where she delivered an emotional speech about sacrifice and patriotism that brought several audience members to tears. The attention was everything Sarah had ever wanted, but it also brought increased scrutiny. People began asking more detailed questions about her service. Other veterans in the community wanted to share stories and compare experiences. Sarah found herself having to create increasingly complex lies to cover for gaps in her knowledge. She invented names of fellow soldiers who had supposedly served alongside her, creating entire personalities and backstories for these fictional characters. When people asked about specific battles or military operations, Sarah would claim she was not at liberty to discuss classified information. She learned to deflect difficult questions by appearing emotional or traumatized, a tactic that usually made people back off out of respect. The local veterans organization began nominating Sarah for regional recognition. They submitted her name for various awards and honors, praising her service and her dedication to helping other veterans adjust to civilian life. Sarah was simultaneously thrilled and terrified by the attention. Each new honor brought her closer to the recognition she craved, but also increased the risk of being discovered. As months turned into a year, Sarah's deception became the defining aspect of her identity. She had almost convinced herself that the stories were real. Sometimes she would catch herself genuinely believing her own lies, feeling phantom pain in her supposedly injured leg or experiencing what she convinced herself were flashbacks to battles she had never fought. The community embraced Sarah completely. She was invited to serve on the board of the local veterans organization and was asked to mentor young people interested in military careers. Parents would bring their children to meet her, telling them to thank the brave soldier for her service. Sarah reveled in these moments, feeling a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from her life for so long. But success brought new challenges. Sarah's story was spreading beyond the small town of Millbrook. Regional veterans groups were taking notice, and she was being invited to speak at larger events in neighboring cities. Each new appearance required more preparation, more research, and more elaborate props to support her claims. She rented a storage unit where she kept an ever-growing collection of military memorabilia, uniforms, and equipment. She practiced her speeches for hours, perfecting the timing of her pauses and the inflection in her voice when she spoke about particularly emotional moments. She studied video footage of real veterans giving testimony about their experiences, copying their mannerisms and expressions. The irony was not lost on Sarah that she was working harder to maintain her fake military identity than she had ever worked at any real job. But the rewards seemed worth the effort. She was receiving speaking fees for her appearances, donations from grateful community members, and even job offers from organizations that wanted to hire a decorated veteran. As winter approached, Sarah received the invitation that would change everything. The State Veterans Organization wanted her to speak at their annual gala, an event that would be attended by hundreds of veterans, military officials, and government dignitaries. It was the kind of recognition Sarah had always dreamed of, but it would also put her in a room full of people who would easily spot any inconsistencies in her story. Sarah knew the risks, but she could not resist the opportunity. She accepted the invitation and began preparing for what she hoped would be her greatest performance yet. She had no way of knowing that among the attendees would be someone whose trained eye would see through her carefully constructed facade in an instant. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just Sarah's deception, but also force the community that had embraced her to confront uncomfortable questions about what they wanted to believe and why they had been so willing to accept her story without question. As Sarah stood in her apartment, practicing her speech in front of a mirror while wearing a uniform she had never earned, she felt a mixture of excitement and dread about the event that would either cement her place as a respected member of the veteran community or destroy everything she had built over the past year. The date was circled in red on her calendar, just 3 weeks away. Sarah had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her, and that the very recognition she had sought would become the instrument of her exposure. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel buzzed with anticipation as hundreds of guests arrived for the annual State Veterans Gala. Sarah Martinez sat in the green room, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her perfectly pressed uniform for the dozenth time. The burgundy dress uniform she wore was an exact replica of one worn by actual Army medics, complete with carefully researched ribbons and medals that told the story of her fictional service. She had spent the previous 3 weeks perfecting every detail of her appearance and presentation. The Purple Heart medal pinned to her chest had been purchased from a military surplus dealer who asked no questions about authenticity. The unit patches on her shoulders corresponded to real medical units that had served in Afghanistan, information she had painstakingly researched through military databases and veteran forums. Sarah's speech was memorized down to the last pause. She had practiced it hundreds of times, incorporating techniques she had learned from watching real veterans share their experiences. She knew exactly when to let her voice crack with emotion, when to pause for effect, and when to look out into the audience with the 1,000-yard stare she had seen in countless war documentaries. The audience filing into the ballroom represented the elite of the state's veteran community. There were retired generals, decorated combat veterans, families of fallen soldiers, and government officials who made policy decisions affecting millions of veterans. Sarah had never performed before such an influential crowd, and the stakes had never been higher. Among the guests taking their seats was General Patricia Hoffman, a recently retired 2-star general who had spent 32 years in the Army, including multiple combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. General Hoffman had agreed to attend the gala as a favor to the event organizers, though she typically avoided such gatherings since her retirement. She preferred the quiet of her new civilian life to the ceremonial aspects of military culture. As the evening's program began, Sarah watched from the wings as various speakers took the stage. There was a Gold Star mother who spoke about her son's sacrifice, a double amputee who discussed his journey of recovery, and a Vietnam veteran who had spent decades advocating for better mental health services. Each speaker was introduced with detailed military histories that had been carefully verified by the organization's research committee. Sarah's introduction was scheduled for the evening's climax, right before the presentation of several major awards. The event coordinator, a well-meaning volunteer named Margaret Chen, had worked tirelessly to promote Sarah's appearance. Margaret had contacted local media outlets, arranged for the speech to be live-streamed, and even invited several military recruiters to attend so they could hear Sarah's inspiring message about military service. When Margaret introduced Sarah to the audience, she painted a picture of heroism that made Sarah almost believe her own story. According to Margaret's glowing introduction, Sarah had not only served 2 tours in Afghanistan but had also saved the lives of 17 soldiers during a particularly fierce battle outside Kandahar. The introduction mentioned commendations that Sarah had never received and described acts of valor that existed only in her imagination. Sarah walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, her military bearing perfect as she approached the podium. She had studied hours of footage showing how real veterans carried themselves during formal events, and she replicated their confident stride and measured gestures with remarkable precision. The spotlight caught the ribbons on her chest, creating small rainbows of color that represented fake achievements in a fictional military career. She began her speech with a moment of silence for fallen comrades, a technique she had seen used effectively by other speakers. The audience respectfully bowed their heads, unaware that the soldiers Sarah claimed to honor existed only in her imagination. She had even prepared fake names and backstories for these fictional fallen heroes, complete with details about their families and their dreams cut short by war. Sarah's voice carried perfectly through the ballroom's sound system as she began to weave the tale of her supposed deployment. She spoke about the heat of the Afghan desert, the sound of helicopters overhead, and the weight of responsibility that came with being responsible for the medical care of her fellow soldiers. Every detail had been carefully researched and rehearsed until it sounded completely authentic. The audience was captivated by her storytelling ability. Sarah had always been a gifted speaker, and months of practice had honed her performance to near perfection. She described treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire, making life-and-death decisions in field hospitals, and the emotional toll of losing patients despite her best efforts. Several audience members wiped away tears as she spoke. But General Hoffman, seated at a table near the front of the ballroom, was listening with growing skepticism. Something about Sarah's presentation felt off, though she could not immediately identify what was bothering her. As someone who had actually served in the medical corps earlier in her career, General Hoffman knew that certain details in Sarah's story did not align with standard military protocols or realistic battlefield conditions. The general noticed that Sarah's uniform, while visually impressive, contained several subtle inconsistencies. The arrangement of ribbons was not quite correct for someone with Sarah's claimed service record. The positioning of certain patches suggested unfamiliarity with actual military dress regulations. Most tellingly, Sarah's combat medical badge was positioned incorrectly, a mistake that no real medic would ever make. As Sarah continued her speech, describing a particular battle where she had supposedly saved multiple lives, General Hoffman realized what was bothering her most. The tactical situation Sarah was describing was impossible given the geography of the region and the standard operating procedures used by medical units in Afghanistan. Sarah was describing scenarios that could never have occurred in the real world, no matter how dramatic they sounded to civilian audiences. Sarah reached the emotional climax of her speech, describing the moment when she had supposedly been wounded by an improvised explosive device while trying to reach an injured soldier. She rolled up her sleeve to show the audience a scar that she claimed was from shrapnel, though General Hoffman could tell from across the room that it was clearly a surgical scar, probably from some minor procedure unrelated to combat. The standing ovation that followed Sarah's speech was overwhelming. The audience was deeply moved by what they believed was a first-hand account of heroism and sacrifice. Several veterans in the audience approached the stage to shake Sarah's hand and thank her for sharing her story. Local media representatives took photographs and conducted brief interviews for their coverage of the event. But General Hoffman remained seated, her expression thoughtful and troubled. As the evening continued with the presentation of awards and recognition ceremonies, the general found herself unable to shake the feeling that she had just witnessed an elaborate deception. Every instinct developed over 3 decades of military service was telling her that Sarah's story was fabricated. During the reception that followed the formal program, General Hoffman made her way through the crowd toward Sarah, who was surrounded by admirers asking questions about her service. The general noticed that Sarah's answers were often vague or deflected with claims about classified information or traumatic memories that were too painful to discuss in detail. When General Hoffman finally reached Sarah's group, she waited patiently for a break in the conversation before introducing herself. Sarah's reaction was immediately telling to someone trained to read people under pressure. There was a flash of recognition and fear in Sarah's eyes when she heard the general's rank and credentials, though Sarah quickly covered it with a bright smile and enthusiastic handshake. General Hoffman began asking seemingly casual questions about Sarah's service, but each question was carefully designed to test the consistency and accuracy of Sarah's story. She asked about specific medical procedures that would have been standard in Sarah's claimed unit, referenced officers who would have been commanding medical units during Sarah's supposed deployment, and mentioned policy changes that would have directly affected someone in Sarah's position. Sarah answered as best she could, drawing on her extensive research and preparation, but General Hoffman could tell that the responses were rehearsed rather than remembered. Sarah's body language changed subtly as the questioning continued, becoming more defensive and evasive. She began looking for opportunities to escape the conversation, claiming she needed to speak with other guests or thanking the general for her service while attempting to move away. But General Hoffman was not finished. With the practiced eye of someone who had spent years evaluating personnel and assessing threats, she began to notice additional details that confirmed her suspicions. Sarah's hands were too soft for someone who had supposedly worked in field conditions for months at a time. Her posture, while military in appearance, lacked the unconscious habits that came from years of actual service. Most importantly, Sarah was missing the intangible quality that General Hoffman had observed in every real combat veteran she had ever met. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, General Hoffman made a decision that would change Sarah's life forever. She approached Margaret Chen, the event coordinator, and requested a private conversation. In a quiet corner of the now nearly empty ballroom, General Hoffman shared her concerns about Sarah's authenticity and suggested that the organization might want to conduct a more thorough verification of Sarah's military record. Margaret's initial reaction was disbelief and defensiveness. Sarah had been thoroughly vetted, she insisted, and had provided documentation of her service. But General Hoffman's credentials and reputation carried significant weight in the veteran community, and her concerns could not be easily dismissed. Margaret agreed to look into the matter more carefully, though she hoped that the general's suspicions would prove to be unfounded. As Sarah packed up her materials and prepared to leave the hotel, she was unaware that her carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. The performance that was supposed to be her greatest triumph had instead planted the seeds of her exposure. General Hoffman's trained eye had seen through the elaborate deception, and the process of verification that would ultimately destroy Sarah's false identity had already begun. The next morning, Sarah would wake up believing that her speech had been a complete success. She would spend the day fielding congratulatory phone calls and planning future speaking engagements. But forces beyond her control were already in motion, forces that would soon reveal the truth about her fabricated military service and force her to face the consequences of her elaborate deception. The morning after the gala, Sarah Martinez woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, all congratulating her on what everyone was calling one of the most powerful speeches they had ever heard. Local news outlets were already running clips from her presentation, and 3 different veterans organizations had reached out about scheduling future speaking engagements. Sarah felt a rush of satisfaction as she scrolled through the messages, believing that her performance had been flawless. She had no idea that Margaret Chen had spent a sleepless night wrestling with General Hoffman's concerns. Margaret sat in her home office at dawn, staring at the paperwork Sarah had submitted when she first applied to join the Veterans Organization 18 months earlier. The documents had seemed authentic at the time, but Margaret realized she had never actually verified them through official military channels. General Hoffman's questions had been specific and troubling. The tactical scenarios Sarah described in her speech were not just improbable, but impossible according to someone who had actually commanded medical units in Afghanistan. The uniform inconsistencies, while subtle, suggested someone who had learned about military dress from photographs rather than experience. Most damaging of all, General Hoffman had pointed out that Sarah's claimed unit assignment would have placed her in a location where no American medical personnel had been stationed during her supposed deployment dates. Margaret began making phone calls to contacts at the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Army Personnel Command. She approached these inquiries delicately, not wanting to cast unfair suspicion on someone who had become a beloved figure in their community. But the responses she received were deeply concerning. There was no record of Sarah Martinez having served in the Army during the timeframe she claimed. Her Social Security number did not appear in any military personnel database. Most conclusively, the unit she claimed to have served with had no record of anyone matching her description. While Margaret conducted her investigation, Sarah was basking in her newfound fame. She gave 3 phone interviews to local radio stations, appeared on the morning news program of the regional television station, and was invited to lunch by the mayor, who wanted to discuss having Sarah serve as the Grand Marshal for the upcoming Veterans Day parade. Each new accolade made Sarah feel more confident that she had successfully fooled everyone. But cracks were beginning to appear in other places as well. Dr. James Morrison, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating combat veterans, had attended the gala and was troubled by inconsistencies he had noticed in Sarah's description of post-traumatic stress symptoms. Sarah had mentioned specific triggers and coping mechanisms that did not align with established patterns of genuine combat trauma. Dr. Morrison had worked with hundreds of veterans over 2 decades, and something about Sarah's presentation felt performative rather than authentic. 3 days after the gala, Margaret received a call that confirmed her worst fears. The Army Personnel Command had completed their search and definitively stated that no Sarah Martinez had ever served in the capacity she claimed. Furthermore, they had cross-referenced her personal information with all branches of the military and found no record of service whatsoever. The documentation Sarah had provided was sophisticated but fraudulent. Margaret faced an agonizing decision. Sarah had become more than just a member of their organization, she had become a symbol of veteran resilience and heroism. Children in local schools had written thank you letters to Sarah. She had inspired young people to consider military service and had helped raise thousands of dollars for veteran support programs. The truth would not only destroy Sarah's life but would also devastate a community that had embraced her story completely. Meanwhile, Sarah was expanding her deception to meet growing demand for her appearances. She had been invited to speak at a military college graduation ceremony, an honor that would place her before an audience of actual military officers and their families. She had also been contacted by a publisher interested in turning her story into a book. The opportunities were everything she had ever dreamed of, but they also increased the risk of exposure exponentially. To prepare for these high-profile appearances, Sarah knew she needed to enhance her backstory with even more detailed fabrications. She spent her days researching specific battles, memorizing the names of real officers who had served in Afghanistan, and creating increasingly elaborate stories about her supposed comrades. She purchased additional military memorabilia and even had fake dog tags made with her fabricated service information. The stress of maintaining such an elaborate deception was beginning to take its toll. Sarah found herself having trouble sleeping, constantly worried about being asked a question she could not answer convincingly. She had to maintain detailed notes about her various lies to ensure consistency across different appearances. The irony was not lost on her that she was experiencing symptoms similar to the post-traumatic stress she claimed to have developed from combat service. General Hoffman, meanwhile, had not forgotten about her suspicions. She contacted several colleagues who had served in medical units in Afghanistan during the timeframe Sarah claimed to have been deployed. None of them had any recollection of Sarah or anyone matching her description. More importantly, they confirmed General Hoffman's assessment that the scenarios Sarah described in her speech were tactically impossible given the actual conditions and procedures that had been in place. The general faced her own ethical dilemma. She could not definitively prove Sarah was lying without access to official personnel records, But her military experience told her with absolute certainty that Sarah's story was fabricated. She was torn between her duty to protect the integrity of military service and her reluctance to destroy someone's life based on suspicion alone. The situation reached a turning point when Sarah was invited to participate in a ceremony honoring fallen veterans. She would be laying a wreath at the State War Memorial alongside Gold Star families and other combat veterans. The ceremony would be broadcast live on television and attended by the governor and other high-ranking officials. It was the kind of recognition Sarah had always craved, but it would also put her in direct contact with people whose loved ones had made the ultimate sacrifice in service of their country. As Sarah prepared for the ceremony, she created backstories for the fictional soldiers she claimed to have lost during her deployment. She gave them names, personalities, and families back home who would supposedly mourn their loss. She practiced speaking their names with the appropriate reverence and emotion, as if these imaginary people had been real friends and colleagues who had died in her arms on foreign battlefields. Margaret Chen could no longer ignore the evidence that was mounting against Sarah. The official military records were clear: Sarah Martinez had never served in the army or any other branch of the military. But confronting Sarah would mean admitting that their organization had been deceived for over a year and that all of Sarah's public appearances had been based on lies. The Veterans Organization Board called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. Some members argued for immediate public disclosure, feeling that allowing Sarah to continue her deception would dishonor real veterans and their sacrifices. Others worried about the damage that would be done to their organization's reputation and questioned whether they should handle the matter privately rather than exposing it publicly. During this meeting, they received another piece of damaging information. A military historian who had attended the gala had been fact-checking Sarah's speech and discovered that the battle she described in such vivid detail had never actually occurred. The geographic locations, unit movements, and casualty reports she cited were complete fabrications that bore no resemblance to actual historical events. Sarah remained oblivious to the investigation swirling around her. She was scheduled to appear on a national morning television program the following week to discuss her service and her advocacy for veteran mental health services. She had already begun preparing for what she hoped would be her breakthrough to national recognition. She had no idea that the very people who had celebrated her were now working to expose her deception. The tension was building toward an inevitable confrontation. Sarah's lies had become too elaborate and her claims too specific to withstand the scrutiny they were now receiving. The community that had embraced her was beginning to realize that they had been deceived by someone who had exploited their respect for military service and their desire to honor those who had sacrificed for their country. As Sarah practiced her television interview in front of her bedroom mirror, wearing the uniform she had never earned and rehearsing stories about battles she had never fought, she had no way of knowing that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. The investigation into her background was nearing completion, and the evidence of her deception was overwhelming. The only question remaining was not whether she would be exposed, but when and how the truth would finally come to light. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only destroy Sarah's fabricated identity but would also force an entire community to confront uncomfortable questions about what they had been willing to believe and why they had never asked for proof of the extraordinary claims they had accepted as truth. The morning of the Veterans Day memorial ceremony dawned crisp and clear, with hundreds of people gathering at the State War Memorial to honor those who had served and sacrificed. Sarah Martinez stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting her dress uniform one final time. Today would be her most visible appearance yet, broadcast live across the state and attended by the governor, senators, and families of fallen heroes. She felt a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that she attributed to the magnitude of the occasion. Margaret Chen arrived at the memorial grounds early, carrying a manila folder that contained the results of her 3-week investigation into Sarah's background. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Sarah Martinez had never served in the military. Every document she had provided was fraudulent, every story she had told was fabricated, and every medal she wore was purchased rather than earned. Margaret had spent sleepless nights agonizing over how to handle this information, but the approaching ceremony had forced her hand. General Hoffman had also arrived early, positioning herself near the speaker's platform where she would have a clear view of the proceedings. She had agreed to attend at Margaret's request, knowing that her military expertise might be needed when Sarah's deception was finally revealed. The general carried herself with the quiet authority that came from 3 decades of military service, her presence a stark contrast to the performance art that Sarah had been presenting for over a year. As guests took their seats, Sarah made her way through the crowd, accepting thanks and congratulations from community members who still believed in her heroic story. She moved with practiced confidence, her military bearing perfect and her responses to questions about her service smooth and rehearsed. She had no idea that several people in the crowd were watching her with skeptical eyes, looking for signs of deception they now knew must be there. The ceremony began with a color guard presentation and the national anthem. Sarah stood at attention with the other veterans, her hand over her heart and her expression appropriately solemn. To casual observers, she looked indistinguishable from the real veterans surrounding her. Only those who knew the truth could see the subtle differences in how she carried herself, the small inconsistencies that marked her as an impostor rather than a genuine veteran. Margaret had planned to confront Sarah privately after the ceremony, but circumstances forced her to act sooner. As Sarah was being introduced to the governor and other dignitaries, Margaret noticed that several journalists were requesting interviews with the decorated war hero. One reporter mentioned plans to feature Sarah's story in a national magazine article about women in combat. The deception was about to spread far beyond their local community, potentially reaching millions of people who would believe Sarah's fabricated story. Margaret made her decision. She approached the group of officials and quietly requested a private word with Sarah. The request seemed routine enough that it did not raise immediate suspicion, but Margaret's serious expression caught General Hoffman's attention. The general moved closer, sensing that the confrontation they had all been anticipating was about to unfold. Sarah followed Margaret to a quiet area behind the memorial platform, assuming she was needed for some last-minute coordination about her role in the ceremony. She was smiling and relaxed, still basking in the attention she had received from the dignitaries. She had no idea that her world was about to collapse around her. Margaret's voice was steady but firm as she began to speak. She explained that concerns had been raised about Sarah's military service and that the organization had conducted a thorough investigation into her background. She presented the folder containing official military records that showed no Sarah Martinez had ever served in the Army during the claimed timeframe. The documentation Sarah had provided had been verified as fraudulent by military personnel experts. Sarah's reaction was immediate and telling. The color drained from her face, and her carefully maintained military posture crumpled as the reality of her situation hit her. For a moment, she seemed frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. Then, her survival instincts kicked in, and she began attempting to explain away the discrepancies, claiming there must be some mistake in the records or that her service had been classified in ways that would not show up in standard databases. But Margaret had prepared for these denials. She had brought copies of specific military regulations that contradicted Sarah's claims, documentation showing that the unit Sarah claimed to have served with had no record of her existence, and expert analysis of the fabricated documents Sarah had submitted. Each piece of evidence systematically dismantled the elaborate fiction Sarah had constructed over the past year. General Hoffman had moved close enough to overhear the confrontation, and her presence seemed to deflate Sarah's resistance even further. The general's experienced eye had spotted the deception from the beginning, and now Sarah realized that her performance had been unconvincing to someone who actually understood military service. The uniform that had seemed so authentic to civilian observers looked obviously wrong to someone who had worn similar uniforms for 3 decades. As the weight of exposure settled on her, Sarah's composure completely collapsed. The confident military bearing she had maintained for months disappeared, replaced by the hunched shoulders and defensive posture of someone caught in an elaborate lie. She began crying, not the controlled tears she had used during her speeches to evoke sympathy, but genuine sobs of desperation and shame. Sarah attempted several different explanations for the discrepancies in her record. She claimed that her service had been so classified that even the military did not have records of it. She suggested that she might have suffered memory loss from her combat injuries and genuinely believed false memories about her service. She even implied that someone else might have stolen her identity and erased her military records. But each explanation sounded more desperate and less believable than the last. Margaret remained calm but firm throughout Sarah's breakdown. She explained that the ceremony could not continue with Sarah in a position of honor, knowing what they now knew about her fabricated service. The other veterans, the Gold Star families, and the entire community deserved better than to be represented by someone who had lied about serving their country. The confrontation attracted the attention of other ceremony organizers and several veterans who had been waiting nearby. As word spread through the crowd that something was wrong, people began gathering around the small group behind the memorial platform. Sarah found herself surrounded by the very people she had been deceiving, many of whom had shared their own genuine stories of military service with her over the past year. One of the most painful moments came when James Patterson, a Vietnam veteran who had befriended Sarah and shared intimate details about his own combat trauma, realized that he had been manipulated by someone who had never experienced anything similar to his genuine suffering. The betrayal was visible on his face as he understood that Sarah had used his real pain to perfect her fictional presentation. General Hoffman stepped forward at this point, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions in challenging circumstances. She explained to the gathered crowd that military records definitively showed that Sarah had never served in any capacity. The uniform she wore, the medals on her chest, and the stories she had told were all part of an elaborate deception that had fooled an entire community. The reaction from the crowd was a mixture of shock, anger, and profound disappointment. Many of these people had honored Sarah for over a year, had thanked her for her service, and had held her up as an example of military heroism. Parents had brought their children to meet her. Veterans had shared their most private experiences with her, believing they were talking to someone who would understand their struggles. Sarah's attempts to explain herself became increasingly incoherent as she faced the reality of what she had done. She had not only lied about her own service but had exploited the genuine respect and gratitude that people felt for real veterans. She had taken advantage of the community's desire to honor those who had served and had used that trust to build a false identity based on fictional achievements. The ceremony organizers faced an immediate crisis. Hundreds of people were gathered for the Veterans Day Memorial, expecting to honor genuine military service and sacrifice. The media was present, and any disruption would become public knowledge within hours. They needed to decide quickly how to handle Sarah's exposure while still maintaining the dignity and purpose of the memorial event. Margaret made the decision to remove Sarah from the ceremony immediately. Security personnel were quietly contacted to escort Sarah from the premises, while ceremony organizers worked to adjust the program without creating a public spectacle that would overshadow the genuine veterans being honored. The goal was to minimize disruption while ensuring that Sarah could not continue her deception for even one more day. As Sarah was led away from the memorial grounds, she looked back at the crowd of people she had deceived for so long. Some faces showed anger, others disappointment, and still others seemed genuinely confused about how they could have been fooled so completely. The community that had embraced her was now watching her disgrace, and she realized that the recognition she had craved had finally come, but not in the way she had ever imagined. The Veterans Day ceremony continued without Sarah, but the mood had been irrevocably changed. The genuine veterans present tried to focus on honoring their fallen comrades and celebrating their service, but Sarah's deception had cast a shadow over the entire event. Questions were already being asked about how such an elaborate fraud could have gone undetected for so long, and what safeguards needed to be implemented to prevent similar deceptions in the future. News of Sarah Martinez's exposure spread through the community with shocking speed. Within hours of her removal from the Veterans Day ceremony, local social media groups were buzzing with disbelief and anger. The woman who had been celebrated as a war hero for over a year had been revealed as an elaborate fraud, and the community that had embraced her was struggling to process the betrayal they felt. The local newspaper, which had featured Sarah in multiple articles over the past year, rushed to publish a breaking news story about her deception. The headline read "Local War Hero Revealed as Impostor," and the article detailed the investigation that had uncovered her lies. The reporter who had originally interviewed Sarah about her service felt personally betrayed, realizing that his touching human interest story had actually been a promotion of fabricated heroism. Sarah returned to her apartment in a state of complete emotional collapse. The confident military bearing she had maintained for months was gone, replaced by the hunched posture of someone who knew their life was about to change dramatically. She sat surrounded by the props of her deception, the uniform she had never earned, the medals she had purchased online, and the photographs she had carefully doctored to support her false claims. The immediate aftermath was overwhelming. Sarah's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters seeking comment about the story. Veterans organizations that had honored her were demanding explanations. The high school where she had spoken at the Veterans Day assembly called to express their disappointment and concern about the message her deception had sent to impressionable students. Margaret Chen faced her own crisis of conscience as the story broke. As the leader of the veterans organization that had embraced Sarah, she felt responsible for the deception that had been perpetrated under her watch. She spent the day fielding angry phone calls from members who wanted to know how such an elaborate fraud had gone undetected for so long. Some questioned whether the organization was competent to represent veterans if they could not even verify the military service of their own featured speakers. General Hoffman found herself at the center of the story as well, praised by many as the hero who had exposed Sarah's deception. Military Times contacted her for an interview about how she had spotted the inconsistencies that others had missed. The general was uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to focus on the damage that had been done to the veteran community rather than her role in exposing the fraud. The psychological impact on the community was profound. People who had thanked Sarah for her service, who had been moved to tears by her speeches, and who had donated money to veteran causes because of her inspiration, now felt foolish and manipulated. Parents who had brought their children to meet the decorated war hero were angry about the false lessons their kids had learned about military service and heroism. Dr. James Morrison, the psychiatrist who had treated many real combat veterans, was particularly disturbed by Sarah's deception. He had noticed inconsistencies in her description of post-traumatic stress symptoms, but had not spoken up because he did not want to challenge someone's claimed trauma. He now worried about the damage Sarah's performance might have done to public understanding of genuine veteran mental health issues. The legal implications of Sarah's deception began to emerge as law enforcement agencies investigated whether any crimes had been committed. While lying about military service was morally reprehensible, the specific laws governing stolen valor had strict requirements about financial gain or tangible benefits that prosecutors would need to prove. Sarah had received speaking fees and donations, but determining whether these constituted criminal violations would require careful legal analysis. Sarah's employer, a local insurance company where she had worked part-time while building her false military identity, immediately terminated her employment. Her supervisor explained that the company could not maintain someone on staff whose character had been so fundamentally misrepresented. Sarah had often mentioned her military background during job interviews and performance reviews, using her fabricated service record to present herself as someone with leadership experience and the ability to perform under pressure. The ripple effects extended beyond Sarah's immediate community. The state veterans organization that had featured her at their annual gala issued a public apology and announced new verification procedures for all future speakers. Military colleges that had been considering inviting Sarah to speak canceled their invitations and implemented stricter background checks for all guest speakers. Social media became a battleground of opinions about Sarah's case. Some people expressed sympathy, suggesting that she might have been suffering from mental illness or seeking attention for deep-seated psychological reasons. Others were furious about the betrayal of trust and demanded harsh punishment for someone who had exploited the sacrifices of real veterans for personal gain. The families of actual fallen soldiers were particularly hurt by Sarah's deception. She had spoken movingly about losing comrades in battle, creating fictional soldiers with families and dreams that had been cut short by war. These fabricated stories had mocked the real pain of Gold Star families who had actually lost loved ones in military service. Several Gold Star mothers issued statements expressing their outrage about someone trivializing their genuine grief for personal recognition. Sarah attempted to craft a public response to the accusations against her, working with a lawyer who specialized in crisis management. Her statement acknowledged that there had been discrepancies in her military record but stopped short of admitting complete fabrication of her service. She claimed that traumatic brain injury from combat might have affected her memories and that she genuinely believed the stories she had told were accurate accounts of her experiences. This explanation satisfied no one and actually made the situation worse. Veterans who had suffered actual traumatic brain injuries were offended by Sarah's attempt to use their genuine condition as an excuse for her elaborate deception. Medical experts pointed out that the type of memory issues Sarah claimed would not result in the creation of detailed, consistent fictional narratives that she had maintained for over a year. The investigation into Sarah's background revealed the staggering amount of effort she had put into creating and maintaining her false identity. Investigators found receipts for hundreds of dollars worth of military surplus equipment, evidence of extensive research into military protocols and procedures, and detailed notes she had kept to maintain consistency in her various lies. The scope of her deception was far more elaborate than anyone had initially realized. Margaret Chen announced that the Veterans Organization would be implementing immediate reforms to prevent similar deceptions in the future. All members would be required to provide official military discharge documents that would be verified through proper military channels. The organization would also establish relationships with military personnel offices to ensure that future verification could be completed quickly and accurately. The community began the difficult process of healing from the betrayal they had experienced. The genuine veterans in the area found themselves having to prove their service in ways they had never needed to before, as Sarah's deception had created an atmosphere of suspicion that hurt everyone. Some veterans who had previously shared their stories openly became more guarded, worried about being questioned or doubted because of one person's lies. Local mental health professionals reported an increase in veterans seeking counseling services in the weeks following Sarah's exposure. Many real veterans felt that their authentic experiences had been cheapened by Sarah's performance, and they struggled with anger and confusion about how someone could fabricate such intimate details about military service and combat trauma. Sarah herself disappeared from public view as the story continued to generate media coverage. Her apartment was eventually vacated, and neighbors reported that she had left town without providing a forwarding address. Some speculated that she had moved to another state where her story was not known, while others wondered if she might attempt to reinvent herself with a different false identity. The legal proceedings against Sarah moved slowly through the court system. Prosecutors had to carefully analyze whether her actions met the specific requirements for stolen valor charges under federal law. While her moral guilt was clear, proving criminal liability required demonstrating that she had received tangible benefits through fraud, a standard that was more difficult to meet than many people realized. The case became a cautionary tale that spread far beyond the original community where Sarah had perpetrated her deception. Military verification organizations used her story as an example of why proper documentation was essential. Veterans groups across the country implemented new policies based on the lessons learned from Sarah's elaborate fraud. The most lasting impact of Sarah's deception was the loss of innocence in a community that had wanted to honor and support military veterans. The trust that had been broken would take years to rebuild, and future genuine veterans would face additional scrutiny because of one person's decision to lie about military service for personal recognition and respect. As months passed and the immediate crisis faded from daily conversation, the community was left to grapple with uncomfortable questions about their own role in Sarah's deception. How had they been so willing to accept extraordinary claims without verification? What did their readiness to believe say about their understanding of military service? And, most importantly, how could they ensure that their desire to honor veterans would never again be exploited by someone seeking unearned recognition for fictional heroism?